The laughter echoed through the polished cafe when Ryan Walker stepped inside, wearing a frayed jacket and worn boots. The city's elite turned smirking, certain the tired man did not belong among their tailored suits and imported coffee. Then a waitress slipped. A full tray of scalding coffee and crystal glasses flew toward a senior executive. Before anyone could react, Ryan pivoted his hands, moving faster than thought, catching every cup, every glass, every drop in under 2 seconds. The room froze. No ordinary man moved like that. Who was he really? The rain had been falling over Seattle for 3 straight days when Ryan Walker stepped off the curb on 5th Avenue and pulled his collar tighter against his neck. His jacket was the same one he had worn for nearly 6 years. The cuffs frayed soft from countless winters, the inner lining patched twice by his own hand. He walked the way a man walks when he has nowhere particular to be and no one waiting for him. His shoulders relaxed, his steps even, his eyes scanning the street out of habit more than caution. To anyone passing by, he looked like one of the hundreds of tired working men who drifted through the city after dark, invisible and unremarkable. He had spent the afternoon repairing a damaged walnut cabinet in a downtown apartment, the kind of careful, patient labor that filled his days now. His hand still smelled faintly of wood oil and varnish, and there was a small splinter buried in the side of his thumb that he had not bothered to remove. He preferred this work to almost anything else. It was quiet. It required precision without violence. It asked him to fix things instead of break them, and after everything he had lived through, that was enough. The cafe on the corner of Madison Street was not the kind of place Ryan would normally enter. Through the glass front he could see polished marble, soft amber lighting, and a long counter lined with imported pastries arranged like museum pieces. The men inside wore tailored suits. The women carried handbags that cost more than his entire monthly rent. But the rain had grown heavier in the last block, and the diner he usually visited was closed for renovations, and he wanted nothing more than a cup of black coffee and 10 minutes off his feet. He pushed the door open. The bell above it gave a soft chime. The warmth of the room hit him, first followed almost immediately by the cold weight of every pair of eyes in the place turning to look at him. Conversations did not stop exactly, but they slowed. A waiter near the counter glanced up from his ledger and then quickly looked away. Ryan felt the familiar pressure of being measured by strangers and found wanting, and he simply ignored it, the way he had learned to ignore most things. He chose a small table near the window and sat down with his back to the wall, the same way he always sat in any room, public or private. From this angle he could see the front door, the rear hallway leading to the kitchen, and the long counter where the espresso machines hissed and gleamed. He set his hands flat on the table and waited for a server. The chair across from him was empty, but his eyes, calm and unhurried, were already mapping the room out of pure instinct. At the far end of the cafe, near a private corner booth, flanked by 2 tall potted ferns, sat a woman in a charcoal blazer. Her name was Claire Bennett, and she ran a defense technology firm called Bennett Dynamics out of a glass tower 15 blocks away. She was in her mid-30s, with the kind of composed face that suggested she had spent years training herself to give nothing away. Across from her, a heavy-set man in his 50s was speaking in a low, persistent tone, sliding documents across the table that she pretended to consider, while her mind worked through other problems entirely. Claire had not chosen this cafe for the coffee. She had chosen it because the booth she preferred allowed her to watch every entrance, and because the manager could be trusted to keep journalists away. The man across from her was a potential partner, the kind who smiled too much and asked too many questions about her firm's contracts. She had already decided not to work with him. The remainder of the meeting was a formality. Her eyes drifted almost out of boredom toward the front of the room, and that was when she first saw Ryan. She noticed his posture before she noticed his clothes. He sat in a way that most civilians did not square to the table weight, evenly distributed hands resting where she could see them. He was not slouching. He was not fiddling with his phone. He had not even removed his jacket, though the room was warm. For a brief moment, Claire forgot the man speaking across from her, and she studied the stranger near the window with the quiet, analytical attention she usually reserved for boardroom rivals. Closer to Ryan, a group of 4 younger men in expensive shirts had gathered at a long table, leaning back in their chairs as if they owned the place. One of them, a clean-shaven man with a heavy gold watch named Brandon, glanced toward Ryan and let out a short, theatrical laugh. He nudged the friend beside him and tilted his head toward the man in the worn jacket. The friend, a thin blonde man called Trevor, joined in with a smirk that he did not even try to hide. "Oh, looks like the soup kitchen got the address wrong," Brandon said loud enough to carry. Trevor laughed harder. A third member of their group, a heavier man named Marcus, leaned forward with mock concern and asked whether someone should call the manager. Their voices were not quite shouting, but they had the careless volume of men who had never been told to be quiet by anyone who mattered to them. Several other patrons turned to watch, half embarrassed and half entertained. Ryan did not look up. He simply continued waiting, his expression unchanged, his hands still flat on the table. A waitress in a white apron, a young woman with tired eyes and dark hair, pulled back tightly, approached his table with a small notepad. She gave him a polite, neutral smile, the kind professionals offered when they were trying to compensate for the rudeness of others around them. Ryan returned the smile with the smallest nod and ordered black coffee, nothing else. The waitress, whose name tag read Hannah, walked back toward the counter, her shoulders held just a little stiffer than before. She had heard the laughter. She had also seen the way the men in the corner were watching her, now waiting for entertainment. She picked up a heavy silver tray from behind the counter and began loading it carefully: 3 espresso cups, 2 tall glasses of sparkling water, and a small ceramic pitcher of steamed milk for a table near the rear. From his booth, Claire watched the entire exchange without moving. She watched the waitress balance the tray. She watched the men at the long table grow louder, emboldened by their own audience. She watched Ryan sit perfectly still, drinking the silence like another man might drink water, untouched by any of it. The businessman across from her was still speaking his voice, a faint hum in her ears, but Claire was no longer listening to a single word. Brandon stood up suddenly, holding a half-empty glass of imported beer, and walked the few steps toward Ryan's table, as if he were doing the room a favor. He set the glass down with a small click and leaned over with a wide, performative grin. "Tell me, friend," he said, his tone soaked in fake politeness, "are you lost? There's a shelter about 4 blocks east. I'd hate for you to waste your evening in the wrong neighborhood." His friends behind him laughed. Ryan finally lifted his eyes. He looked at Brandon for perhaps 2 full seconds, and there was nothing in his expression. No anger, no embarrassment, no fear. Just a calm, total attention that did not belong to a man in old clothes and did not match anything Brandon had expected. The younger man's grin flickered the way a candle flickers when a door opens somewhere in the house. He stood there for another moment, then forced a laugh, picked up his glass, and walked back to his table, muttering something that earned him another round of giggles from his friends. Claire saw the flicker too. She had watched men collapse in negotiations before. She knew the exact micro-expression of someone realizing they had walked into the wrong room. Brandon had just had that moment, and he did not even understand why. Whatever Ryan was, Claire thought he wasn't what the room had decided he was. She set down her coffee cup and turned her full attention to the front of the cafe. Behind the counter, Hannah lifted the loaded tray and began moving toward the rear table. She walked carefully the way she had been trained, weaving between chairs with practiced steps. She had done it 1,000 times. But the polished marble floor near Ryan's table had a small wet patch where a customer had tracked rain inside, and Hannah did not see it. Her left heel slipped sideways with no warning. Her body twisted hard, her balance gone in a fraction of a second, and the heavy silver tray launched forward and downward out of her hands. The room registered the disaster a heartbeat later. 3 espresso cups scalding hot, tumbled through the air toward the back of the businessman across from Claire. 2 heavy glasses spun off the tray and arced toward the marble floor. The ceramic pitcher of steamed milk flipped upside down. Hannah herself was falling, her arms thrown out her face, frozen in the kind of helpless panic that no training could prevent. The whole moment stretched out like glass about to shatter. Ryan moved before anyone in the room had even begun to gasp. He was up out of his chair in the same motion that his eyes had registered. Hannah's slip, his body pivoting smoothly toward her, one arm extending to catch her shoulder, and the other rising in a fast, clean arc beneath the falling tray. His feet rearranged themselves without thought, knees soft weight low. There was no panic in him. There was no hesitation. There was only a sequence of small, precise actions executed so quickly that the people watching could not separate one from the next. His left hand steadied Hannah at the waist before she hit the floor, taking her weight just enough to hold her upright. His right arm swept beneath the tumbling tray, palm flat, and caught it dead level in midair. The 3 espresso cups settled back into their saucers with a soft clatter. The 2 glasses, still spinning, dropped neatly into the crook of his elbow, where he had angled it for exactly that purpose. The ceramic pitcher fell directly into his open hand, milk still inside. Not a single drop on the marble floor. 2 seconds, maybe less. From the moment Hannah's heel slipped to the moment Ryan stood there holding the tray, the waitress and every piece of glassware in perfect balance, no more than 2 seconds had passed. The cafe went absolutely silent. The hiss of the espresso machine continued in the background. The rain still tapped against the window, but no human in the room made a single sound. Brandon's mouth had fallen open. Trevor and Marcus stared without blinking. The businessman across from Claire had half risen from his seat in anticipation of the burn and was now frozen in that awkward crouch, unsure whether to sit back down or applaud. The manager near the counter had one hand pressed to his chest. Even the older couple by the window had stopped mid-sentence, their forks suspended in the air above their plates. Hannah looked up at Ryan with her eyes wide, her breath caught in her throat. He did not say anything to her. He simply nodded, once helped her steady herself on her feet, and set the tray gently back onto her hands with a quiet care that made her almost want to cry. Then he turned and walked back to his own table, sat down, and folded his hands again, as if nothing at all had happened. Claire had not moved. Her coffee cup was still suspended halfway between the saucer and her mouth. She lowered it very slowly. In her years of running a defense firm, she had met soldiers, contractors, mercenaries, and security operatives from a dozen countries. She had watched men train, fight, and die. She had developed a particular eye for the kind of body that had been built by violence and the kind of mind that had been built by discipline. Ryan Walker carried both. She had never seen a civilian move that way. She was not entirely sure he was a civilian at all. The men at the long table did not laugh again. Brandon picked up his beer, drained half of it in one swallow, and stared down at the surface of the table. Trevor cleared his throat. Marcus pretended to be looking at his phone. The energy in the room had shifted in a way none of them could explain, but all of them could feel. Within 10 minutes, the 4 of them had paid their bill and left without another word. Hannah brought Ryan his coffee a few minutes later. She set it down in front of him, with hands that were still trembling slightly, and she whispered a thank you that was barely audible. Ryan met her eyes and offered a small, genuine smile that lasted only a second, but reached her completely. "It's all right," he said quietly. "Just be careful on that patch, by the door." She nodded and walked away with her composure rebuilt. Claire ended her meeting 12 minutes later. She did not bother to pretend she was still considering the partnership. She rose, shook the man's hand with cool finality, and walked him to the door with the same polite efficiency she used to dismiss everyone who did not interest her. When she returned to her booth, she did not sit down. She stood for a long moment at the corner of the bar, watching the man in the worn jacket finish his black coffee in slow, measured sips, his eyes occasionally drifting to the rain-slicked street beyond the window. She did not know his name yet. She did not know where he lived, what he did for work, or why a man who could move like that was drinking coffee alone in a cafe where strangers had laughed at him only minutes before. But Claire Bennett had built her entire career on noticing things other people missed, and she had just noticed something she could not let go of. She pulled a slim phone from her blazer pocket, dialed a number she did not use often, and spoke into it in a low-controlled voice. "I need a full background workup," she said. "Quiet. Tonight. The subject is sitting in a cafe on Madison. I want to know who he is by morning." She listened for a moment, then ended the call, slid the phone back into her pocket, and walked past Ryan's table on her way out. She did not look at him directly. He did not look at her. But as she stepped through the door and into the rain, she had the distinct feeling that her ordinary evening had ended the moment a tray of coffee had begun to fall, and that whatever came next would not be ordinary at all. Outside, the rain continued. Inside the cafe, Ryan finished his coffee, paid in cash, left a generous tip beneath the saucer for Hannah, and walked out into the wet street with the same unhurried calm he had brought with him. He had no idea that a woman he had barely glanced at was already pulling on the first thread of a life he had spent 6 long years trying to bury, and that within 24 hours, the silence he had built around himself would be torn open completely. By 6 o'clock the next morning, a thin manila folder was sitting on Claire Bennett's desk at Bennett Dynamics. The man she had hired to compile it was one of the best in the city, and he had not slept. He had also charged her 3 times his usual rate, and asked in a careful voice whether she was certain she wanted to know what was inside. Claire had told him to leave the folder and go home. Now she stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of her 30th floor office, the folder open in her hands, reading slowly. The name printed at the top of the first page was Ryan Walker, but almost every other entry on the page had been redacted at some point in the last several years and partially reconstructed from open sources. Military service from age 19, special operations selection at 23, a classified tactical unit designation withheld with deployments in regions the public was not supposed to know existed, commendations she could not legally see, a medical discharge filed under a non-combat code that almost certainly meant something else. Halfway through the folder, the tone of the report changed. A short paragraph noted that Ryan Walker's wife, a civilian aid worker, had been killed in what was officially recorded as a roadside accident overseas 6 years and 4 months ago. The report flagged inconsistencies. The accident had occurred in a region where a private security contractor had been operating without authorization, and 3 witnesses had later died under unrelated circumstances. The investigator had marked the entire incident with a small red asterisk and a single handwritten word cleaned. Claire closed the folder and rested it carefully on the corner of her desk. The man who had caught a falling tray in 2 seconds was a former tactical operator who had walked away from his entire life after losing his wife to something that had been deliberately buried. He had not chosen anonymity by accident. He had chosen it as a kind of mourning. And he had chosen a cafe on Madison Street on a rainy evening, to step inside for 10 minutes and disappear again into a life that had nothing to do with hers. She walked to her desk, sat down, and opened her laptop. There was a small, persistent voice in her head telling her to put the folder in her safe, forget she had ever read it, and let the man return to whatever quiet existence he had built. She listened to the voice for almost a full minute. Then she ignored it. She typed out an address she had also paid to obtain, copied it onto a slip of paper, and slipped the paper into the inner pocket of her blazer. The night that followed her decision was the night her life cracked open. Claire left her office at 11 o'clock, dismissed her driver 3 blocks early because she wanted to walk, and was crossing the small private courtyard behind her building when 2 black SUVs pulled in from opposite ends of the alley with their headlights off. 4 men in dark jackets stepped out at almost the same time moving with the easy coordination of people who had practiced this exact arrival many times. None of them were holding weapons openly, but Claire could see the shape of holsters under their coats. She had time to take 3 steps backward and reach for her phone before one of the men called her name in a calm, professional tone that frightened her more than shouting would have. She turned to run. A second man cut off her path. The first man closed the distance between them in a few quick strides, and Claire understood, with a sudden sickening clarity, that whatever was happening was not a robbery, not a kidnapping for ransom, and not a mistake. They had come for her specifically. What none of them saw was the figure crossing the rooftop, 2 buildings over, moving along the parapet with the kind of silent economy that came from training a person did not forget. Ryan had been finishing a late repair job in an office 2 blocks from Bennett Dynamics when he stepped out for air and caught sight of the SUVs gliding through the alley with their headlights off. He had recognized the pattern of their movement before they had even reached the courtyard. He had not planned to be there, but he had seen the cars and he had seen the woman from the cafe walking alone, and something inside him that he had buried for 6 years had decided for him before he could argue. He dropped from the lower edge of a fire escape into the alley with a soft, controlled landing and crossed the open space behind the second SUV before the driver had finished checking his side mirror. The first man laid a hand on Claire's shoulder. Ryan reached him a second later. There was no warning. There was only a short, brutal sequence of movements, an elbow to the man's jaw, a sweep of the leg behind his knee, a controlled drop that took him to the concrete face down and unconscious in less time than it had taken him to step out of the SUV. The second man turned, drawing his weapon, and Ryan was already inside his guard, deflecting the barrel of the pistol with the edge of his forearm and driving the heel of his other hand into the man's temple in a single motion. The third man fired once the round, punching into the brick wall behind Claire, and Ryan crossed the space between them in 3 long strides, taking the gun out of his hand with a sharp twist that broke at least 2 of his fingers and folding him onto the ground. The fourth man tried to retreat into the SUV. Ryan caught him by the back of his collar before he could reach the door. The entire exchange lasted no more than 20 seconds. Claire had not moved from where she stood. She was breathing in small, sharp inhales, her hand still half raised toward her phone, and she watched the man she had been investigating that very morning kneel beside the third attacker, search him efficiently for identification and earpieces, and rise again as if he had done nothing more strenuous than rearrange furniture. He turned to her with the same calm face she had seen in the cafe, and he said only 4 words. "We need to move." She did not argue. Some part of her, the part that had built a defense firm from nothing, recognized that arguing with this man right now would be the most expensive mistake of her life. She let him guide her out of the courtyard through a side passage she had not known existed and into the back seat of a battered work van parked 2 blocks away. The van smelled of wood and varnish and the faint trace of motor oil. He climbed into the driver's seat, pulled into traffic without rushing, and drove for 10 silent minutes before he spoke again. "Whoever they are, they're professionals," Ryan said, his eyes on the rearview mirror. "They knew your schedule. They knew your routes. That means somebody close to you sold the information." His tone was not accusing. It was simply observational, the voice of a man reading a familiar map. Claire stared at the side of his face and tried to assemble the right question out of the dozens crowding her throat. She settled on the simplest one. "Why did you help me?" she asked. Ryan did not answer immediately. He took a turn onto a quieter street and checked the mirror again. "Because I saw it coming," he said, "and because nobody else was going to." He glanced at her once briefly, then looked back at the road. "You should know that the moment I stepped into that alley, my life stopped being quiet. So whatever this is, you don't have to explain it to me. Just tell me who wants you dead and how badly," Claire told him. She told him about a contract bid Bennett Dynamics had won 6 weeks earlier, a defense systems contract that had been expected to go to a rival firm. She told him about a server. Her engineers had quietly archived a server containing communications that suggested the rival firm had been falsifying performance data to inflate their bids for over a decade. She told him she had been preparing to release portions of the archive to federal investigators when she was attacked tonight. She did not tell him the name of the rival firm because she did not yet know whether trusting him that far was wise. Ryan did not press her on the name. He drove for another 40 minutes, switching streets twice, before pulling into the garage of a small auto repair shop owned by a friend who would not ask questions. They moved her into a different vehicle, an unremarkable gray sedan, and continued north out of the city. By 2 in the morning, they were in a small cabin in the woods, east of Snoqualmie, a place Ryan had owned under a different name for almost 5 years and had never spoken to anyone about. The cabin had a wood stove, a battered couch, and a kitchen with 2 cabinets full of canned food and clean ammunition. Claire walked through it slowly, taking in the modest order of a life she could not have imagined the day before. There were no photographs on the walls. There was a single shelf of worn paperbacks. There was a stripped-down rifle on the kitchen table mid-cleaning, as if Ryan had been interrupted weeks ago and never returned. She sat down on the couch and finally let her hands shake. Over the next several hours, while she slept fitfully in the back room, Ryan worked. He laid out the IDs he had taken from the men in the alley on the kitchen table. He cross-referenced their names against several databases he was not technically supposed to access. By dawn, he had a clear picture of the unit. They belonged to a private security firm with deep contracts and a long shadow. The name of that firm was Titan Group. The CEO of Titan Group was a man named Victor Hale, and the moment Ryan read that name, he set the phone down on the table and did not move for a long, cold minute. He had served alongside Victor Hale for 6 years in their old unit. He had trusted him with his life on 3 continents. He had also watched Victor walk away from that unit under quiet circumstances 18 months before Ryan's wife was killed overseas, and he had spent the years since deliberately cutting himself off from any news that might tell him where Victor had gone. He had not wanted to know. He had wanted only to forget. Now, with the IDs of 4 Titan Group operators on his kitchen table, the answer he had refused to seek had arrived on its own. He picked up the phone, dialed a number he had not used in years, and left a short message for an old contact who still worked inside the agency. When Claire woke, Ryan told her the name. He watched her face change as she connected the dots, and he saw her professional composure return like a door closing. Titan Group is the parent company of the firm we outbid, she said quietly. Victor Hale sits on the board of 3 other defense contractors. If the archive on our server goes public, half of his portfolio collapses, and he ends up under federal indictment. Ryan nodded slowly. The hunt for her was not corporate jealousy. It was containment. Victor was not trying to win a contract. He was trying to bury a corpse. They spent the rest of the morning trying to stay alive. By midday, a second team had located the cabin somehow, and Ryan was leading Claire on foot through the dense forest behind the property as gunfire chewed bark off the trees around them. He moved her along old trails he had walked 100 times, drawing the attackers into uneven terrain where their numbers no longer helped them. He took down 2 of them with a hunting rifle from a covered position. He disarmed a third in a hand-to-hand exchange beside a creek that left blood in the water and the man unconscious against a tree. Claire saw for the first time in her life what a fully committed professional looked like when he stopped holding back. He did not speak during the fight. He did not waste a single movement. He shifted positions every few seconds, fired in clean, controlled bursts, and read the forest around them as if the trees themselves were telling him where the enemy stood. And yet every time he passed her, his hand briefly touched her elbow or her shoulder, a small, grounding gesture that reminded her she was not alone in the woods. By evening, they were in a different safe house, this one a windowless room above an old machine shop in Tacoma, lent to Ryan by another old friend, whose name he never said aloud. Claire sat on a folding chair with a blanket around her shoulders, watching him clean a long cut on his forearm with steady hands. He had taken a graze in the second exchange that he had not mentioned at the time. She had only noticed it when blood began dripping onto the floor of the truck. "You could have died today," she said quietly. Ryan did not look up from the bandage. "So could you," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "But I'm the one they want. You stepped into this for me." She watched him tie the bandage off with his teeth. "What?" She asked again the same question from the van, but softer this time. He sat back against the wall and looked at her for a long moment with an expression she could not read. Because somewhere along the line, he said, "I decided that walking away from people in trouble cost me more than walking toward them." His voice was quiet, almost matter-of-fact. "I lost someone a long time ago. I told myself the world was no longer mine to fix. I've been telling myself that for 6 years. He glanced down at his hands. "Last night, watching those men close in on you, I realized I'd been lying to myself the whole time. You can't stop being who you are. You can only pretend until something happens that won't let you pretend anymore." Claire did not respond right away. She thought of the redacted pages in the folder on her desk and the small red asterisk beside the words about his wife. She thought of the way he had moved in the cafe in the alley in the woods, with the unshakable focus of a man who had spent years training his body to keep going while his heart stayed somewhere else entirely. She finally understood that the worn jacket and the quiet eyes had not been a disguise. They had been a wound slowly closing. "Then help me finish this," she said. "Not just survive. Finish it. If we keep running, they keep coming, and eventually they win." Ryan looked up at her. There was a brief flicker of something old and sharp in his eyes, a part of him he had not let out of its cage in a long time. He nodded once slowly. "You're right," he said. "We stop running. We go after him. We bring the archive directly to people who can use it, and we make sure Victor Hale doesn't walk away clean again." The plan that took shape over the next several hours was simple in concept and brutal in execution. They would breach Titan Group's central data facility, a fortified building in the industrial district, where Victor had personally consolidated the most sensitive records of his operations. They would extract physical evidence, linking him to the falsified contracts, the unauthorized overseas operations, and the targeted killings used to clean up afterward. They would route it to federal investigators and to 2 journalists Claire trusted, and they would do it within 48 hours before Victor finished destroying every piece of paper that could put him in a courtroom. Ryan slept for 3 hours that night, which was more than he had allowed himself in 2 days. Claire did not sleep at all. She sat at the small table in the corner of the room, going over the floor plans Ryan had quietly acquired, marking entry points and security blind spots in a steady, methodical hand. The woman who had once dismissed a partnership in 12 minutes was now planning an infiltration of one of the most heavily guarded private facilities on the West Coast, and she was doing it with the same cool efficiency she brought to every other decision in her life. In the early hours before dawn, she looked over at Ryan asleep on the floor beside the door, with a pistol within easy reach of his hand, and she understood that whatever else came of this, the man she had hired an investigator to find would never go back to being a stranger in a cafe again. He had stepped into her life by catching a falling tray, and he had stayed in it by stepping in front of a falling world. Whatever happened in the next 48 hours, she was no longer alone in the fight, and neither for the first time in 6 years was he. The Titan Group data facility sat on a strip of reclaimed industrial land south of the city, ringed by chain-link motion sensors and a perimeter patrol that rotated every 22 minutes. From the roof of a warehouse half a mile away, Ryan watched the building through a pair of compact binoculars, while Claire crouched beside him with a tablet displaying the security schematics. The rain had returned at sundown, light and steady, masking the soft sounds of their breathing and the faint hum of the city behind them. They had picked their window with care. The shift change at the data facility happened at 2 in the morning, and for roughly 4 minutes, the rotating guards walked past each other on the south side of the building, leaving the eastern utility corridor briefly underwatched. It was not a real opening. It was the closest thing to one that existed. Ryan had decided he would rather take a narrow window than wait for a wider one Victor Hale would never give them. He had also accepted quietly, and without saying it aloud, that he might not walk out of the building tonight. He had made that kind of acceptance before many times in his old life, and the feeling came back to him with the familiarity of an old habit. What surprised him was that this time the acceptance was not numb. It was sharp alert and full of something he had not felt in 6 years. He wanted to live. He wanted Claire to live. And he wanted the man inside that building to answer for everything he had done. They crossed the open ground beside the eastern fence at 1:57 in the morning. Ryan went first, cutting through the chain link with a small set of tools he had carried in his jacket since he was 25. Claire followed 2 steps behind him, her movement steady, her breathing controlled. She had never done anything like this before in her life. She did exactly what he told her to do, and nothing more, and her composure surprised even her. Inside the utility corridor, Ryan disabled 2 cameras with adhesive patches. He had prepared earlier, neutralized a single guard with a quick chokehold that left the man unconscious but uninjured, and led Claire down a narrow staircase toward the basement levels where the central servers were housed. The air down there was cold and dry, scrubbed clean by industrial dehumidifiers, and the only sound was the soft white roar of cooling fans behind sealed glass walls. The server room itself required a biometric key. Claire had anticipated this. She produced a small device the size of a paperback, attached it to the reader, and ran a program her engineers at Bennett Dynamics had built specifically for situations she had never expected to actually face. 38 seconds later, the door clicked open. They moved inside, found the dedicated cluster Ryan's contact had identified as Victor's private archive, and began copying its contents onto 2 encrypted drives Claire had brought in a thin pouch beneath her jacket. The copy was almost complete when the lights changed. The soft white of the server room shifted abruptly to a steady amber, and a deep mechanical lockdown alarm began pulsing through the corridors above them. Ryan did not curse, did not freeze, did not look at Claire. He simply pulled the second drive free, slid it into his inner pocket, and drew the pistol from his hip in one smooth motion. Their 48-hour plan had just collapsed to whatever time they could buy with their own bodies. He led her back up the stairwell at a measured pace, listening to the patterns of boots on the floor above. 3 teams he counted. Maybe 4. Heavily armed. Coordinating through earpieces. He turned to Claire on the landing and pressed one of the drives into her hand. "If I tell you to run," he set his voice low, "you run. You don't look back. You get this to the people on your list. That's the only thing that matters now." Claire opened her mouth to argue. She did not. She nodded once and put the drive away. What followed was the longest 7 minutes of her life. Ryan moved through the corridors of the facility with a precision that frightened her almost as much as the men hunting them. He took down the first team in a service hallway with 2 quick shots and the butt of his pistol. He led her up a freight stairwell, while the second team chased shadows on the wrong floor. He kicked a fire door open and put down a third operator who had been waiting on the other side, dropping the man in a clean, fast exchange that left Ryan breathing hard but unhurt. They made it to the executive level on the top floor before the 4th team caught up with them. Ryan turned at the end of a long glass-walled corridor and held them off with steady fire, while Claire reached the heavy oak doors at the far end. He took a round high in his left shoulder during the exchange, the impact spinning him half a step sideways, but he did not stop firing. He simply transferred the weight to his right arm, dropped 2 more attackers, and forced the remaining men back behind cover long enough for him to follow Claire through the doors and slam them shut behind him. The room beyond was Victor Hale's private office. It was wood-paneled, dimly lit, and entirely silent. A long mahogany desk stood at the far end, and behind it, in a high-backed leather chair, sat the man himself. He was older than Ryan remembered, his hair gone almost completely gray at the temples, but his face still had the same sharp, watchful intelligence Ryan had known across 6 years of shared deployments. He was not afraid. He was not even surprised. He simply set down the glass of bourbon in his hand and rose from the chair. "Ryan." Victor said, his voice quiet, almost warm. "I wondered when you'd come." He glanced briefly at Claire, dismissed her with a short flick of his eyes, and returned his attention to the man bleeding onto the carpet of his office. "I told them not to underestimate you. I told them repeatedly. But they always think a man who's been out of the field for 6 years has gone soft. They never learn." He smiled, a small expression with nothing pleasant in it. Ryan did not lower the pistol. The blood from his shoulder was running down his sleeve and dripping onto the back of his hand, but his aim did not waver. "You sent 4 men to kill her in an alley," he said. "You sent another team to a cabin I didn't think anyone knew about. You've been running this kind of operation for years, Victor. Tell me how long." Victor watched him for a moment, then walked slowly around the desk, with his hands held loosely at his sides, as if they were old friends finishing a delayed conversation. "Longer than you'd want to hear," Victor said. "Long enough that the unit you and I served in was already half compromised by the time you got your medical discharge. Long enough that certain operations overseas, the ones nobody was supposed to know about, were paying my contractors before they paid the men who actually carried them out. You think I built Titan from nothing in 7 years on legitimate work? I built it on everything we did and pretended we didn't." His tone was casual, almost bored. Ryan's grip on the pistol tightened. There was a question he did not want to ask, and he asked it anyway. "My wife," he said. "The road in the eastern province, the witnesses who died later. That was your operation, wasn't it?" Victor looked at him for a long moment, and the small, polite smile faded from his face. He did not nod. He did not need to. The silence in the office said everything the next sentence would have said, and Ryan watched 6 years of unanswered grief gather behind his ribs like a wave finally finding the shore. "She wasn't supposed to be there," Victor said at last, his voice flat. "We had information that a journalist was about to make contact with a man we needed to handle. The convoy went up. She was 30 meters from the wrong vehicle at the wrong moment. I made the call to clean the witnesses afterward because that's what the work required. I didn't know she was your wife until 2 weeks later. By then, telling you would have ended both of us." He looked at Ryan with something that almost resembled regret. "So I let you grieve." Ryan did not speak. The room blurred at the edges of his vision, not from blood loss, but from something far older and far heavier. For 6 years he had carried the death of his wife as a private weight, a thing he had failed to prevent and could not understand. Now the weight had a face, and the face was the face of a man he had trusted with his own life. Behind him, Claire stood very still, her hand pressed flat against the wood of the door, watching him with a quiet horror she did not try to hide. Victor took another step forward. "You can shoot me now," he said softly. "And the security teams downstairs will kill both of you within the hour. Or you can put the gun down, give me the drives, and walk out of here alive. I'll even let her keep her company. Quietly. Nothing public. Nothing messy. Everyone goes back to their lives." His voice was gentle. It was the voice of a man who had used the same speech, almost word for word, on dozens of other people in dozens of other rooms, and had been believed every time. Ryan looked at him. He felt the slow, cold tide of his old self rising inside him, the tactical operator he had buried beneath 6 years of wood oil and varnish, and he let it come up the rest of the way for the first time. But he did not pull the trigger. He lowered the pistol very slightly, took one short breath, and spoke in a voice that was not raised, was not shaking, and was not asking for anything. "No," he said. "We're going to do this the other way." Victor's smile returned, faint and tired. "I was hoping you'd say that," he said. Victor moved faster than Ryan had expected from a man his age. He drew a short, slim pistol from beneath the back of his jacket in a single motion and fired twice, and Ryan was already moving when the first round went past his ear. The second round caught him in the side low against the edge of his vest. He closed the distance between them in 3 long strides and drove his uninjured shoulder into Victor's chest, taking them both down onto the heavy desk. The bourbon glass shattered. Papers scattered across the floor. What followed was not a fight between strangers. It was a fight between 2 men who had trained together, who knew each other's habits and instincts, who had watched each other survive impossible nights more than once. Victor was older, but he had not slowed as much as Ryan had hoped. They traded short, brutal exchanges across the surface of the desk, neither willing to give ground, both bleeding before half a minute had passed. Claire watched from the door with the second drive clutched against her chest. Her own breath caught somewhere between fear and refusal to look away. Ryan got his hand around Victor's wrist on the third exchange and twisted hard enough to feel the bone shift. The pistol fell. He took Victor down to the floor with a low sweep, dropped a knee onto his chest, and held him there with the full weight of everything he had been carrying for 6 years. Victor looked up at him with blood on his teeth and the same calculating composure he had worn behind the desk. "Do it," he said, almost daring him. "Finish it the way the work taught you." Ryan looked down at him for a long, cold moment. The part of him that wanted to do exactly that was loud and old and entirely justified. But the part of him that had spent 6 years learning how to fix walnut cabinets instead of break men was louder. He drove his fist into the side of Victor's jaw hard and clean, and the man went limp beneath him. Ryan rose unsteadily, took the small pistol from the floor, and turned to find Claire already at the desk's computer, transferring the contents of the second drive onto a public channel her engineers had built for exactly this kind of last resort. She worked through the lockdown alarm and the shouting in the corridor, and the blood drying on Ryan's clothes. Within 4 minutes, every file from Victor's archive was in the hands of 2 federal investigators, 3 journalists, and an oversight committee Claire had been quietly courting for almost a year. The information would land in public news cycles before dawn. By the time the security teams finally breached Victor's office, what they found was their CEO unconscious on the floor, an empty desk, and a man and a woman standing together beside the window, with nothing left to hide. Ryan and Claire walked out of the Titan Group facility under the protection of a federal response team that had been dispatched the moment Claire's archive landed in the right inbox. Victor was taken into custody before he regained consciousness. Within 72 hours, the network of contractors, board members, and corrupt officials he had spent more than a decade building began to come apart in public, one indictment at a time. 3 Senate hearings were scheduled within the month. Titan Group's stock collapsed before the markets closed on Friday. Ryan spent the next several days in a private medical facility on the outskirts of the city, recovering from 2 gunshot wounds, a deep laceration on his forearm, and a level of physical exhaustion he had not allowed himself to feel in years. Claire visited him every afternoon. She did not bring flowers because she had decided early on that Ryan was not a flowers kind of man. She brought coffee and a folding chair, and the patient willingness to sit with him in silence for as long as he wanted. Some afternoons he talked. Most afternoons he simply rested and let her presence be enough. 3 months later, on a clear afternoon in early autumn, Ryan walked back into the cafe on Madison Street, wearing the same worn jacket he had worn the night the tray had fallen. The bell above the door chimed softly. The room was quieter than he remembered, and warmer. Hannah, the waitress, looked up from behind the counter, and the smile that crossed her face was wide and unguarded. The manager near the espresso machine stopped what he was doing and nodded at Ryan with a respect he could not have managed 3 months earlier. Several of the regulars who had been there the night of the falling tray were sitting at their usual tables, and one by one they looked up at Ryan with quiet acknowledgement. There was no laughter this time. There were no smirks. The man at the door was no longer a stranger to be measured and dismissed. He was a man whose name some of them had now read in the newspapers, and whose story most of them had only learned in fragments, but whose presence in their cafe they all now understood differently. Ryan walked to the small table by the window and sat down with his back to the wall, the same way he always did. A few minutes later, the bell above the door chimed again, and Claire Bennett walked in, wearing a soft gray coat and carrying 2 paper cups of coffee from a shop down the street, the kind of small, ordinary gesture neither of them had ever expected to share. She sat down across from him, set one of the cups in front of him, and smiled the smallest, most honest smile he had seen from her yet. They did not speak for a long while. They did not need to. Outside, the late afternoon light fell soft and gold across the wet street. Inside, the espresso machine hissed gently behind the counter, and the rain that had defined the night of their first meeting was nowhere in sight. Ryan picked up his coffee, took a slow sip, and felt for the first time in 6 long years the unfamiliar and almost startling sensation of a life that was no longer waiting for him to disappear from it. He had stopped running, and somewhere in the quiet of an ordinary cafe on an ordinary afternoon, he had finally completely come home.